Good evening, and thanks so much for joining me today to hear a little about Oregon's Willamette Valley and its connections to the U.S. Navy. I'm the curator of Puget Sound Navy Museum in Bremerton, Washington, where we're all about the Navy history of the Pacific Northwest. Now, Oregon has more ties to the U.S. Navy than you might initially think. No, it doesn't have a massive shipyard like Bremerton's Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, or decades of time spent hosting boot camp like San Diego, but nonetheless, U.S. Navy history has been incredibly important to the state of Oregon. Oregon's connection to the Navy dates all the way back to the 1840s, when explorers arrived by sea. A century later, during World War II, Oregon's coastline became a critical defense point and home to numerous Navy installations. And even Salem itself, while not a coastal city, has a fascinating naval history. Tonight, join me to explore the pivotal events of Oregon's naval heritage and the remarkable individuals who have helped to shape it. Now, the history of the Navy in Oregon goes all the way back to the early 1840s. The first U.S. naval presence in the Pacific Northwest was the arrival of the U.S. Exploring Expedition, or the Wilkes Expedition, named after its leader, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes. Now, this was a big scientific expedition that sought to map the Pacific Northwest from 1938 to 1942. This was a pretty big deal because they wanted to create accurate charts of all the islands and all the hazards for ships that might be traveling to the Pacific Northwest coastline. But it was really a much bigger expedition than that. So Lieutenant Wilkes, he was selected to command the expedition, about 6 ships and 500 or so people. They left Virginia in 1838 and eventually made their way all the way around to the Columbia River by April of 1841. And they visited lots of the places around the Pacific Northwest that were accessible by water, like Puget Sound and Hood Canal, and then they came back to the mouth of the Columbia, where one of their ships, USS Peacock, was actually lost on a sandbar. And so most of those with this expedition spent the summer of 1841 heading inland by land to Fort Nisqually down by Olympia, to the Cascades, the Mount Rainier area, to Fort Walla Walla over in eastern Washington, lots of other destinations. And then they even came to Salem, Oregon, where they met with settlers at the newly founded Methodist mission that was located there. Now, the group headed back east in 1842, taking with them lots of plant specimens and artifacts and fossils and other records of their journeys, a lot of which ended up in the Smithsonian. And another big effect of this expedition is they actually named lots of places along the route that they traveled. There's even an area of Antarctica named for Wilkes. And they published this map of the Oregon Territory. The Wilkes expedition had quite literally helped put the Pacific Northwest on the map. Now, coincidentally, one of the ships involved in this expedition was USS Oregon, named in honor of Oregon Territory. It was a former trading ship that the expedition members bought in Astoria, Oregon in 1841. This was after that ship had been wrecked on a sandbar there, so they needed a replacement. And USS Oregon was in commission till 1845. So in this service, she was the first of actually 3 U.S. Navy ships that have been named for the state of Oregon. Now, because of the time period in which she served, there are no actual photos of the first USS Oregon, but this illustration shows the ships of the Wilkes expedition and what they would have looked like. Now, the second USS Oregon was a battleship, and it saw action in the Spanish-American War, and actually served from 1896 to 1919. She would have visited Bremerton's Puget Sound Navy Yard several times during her career. So this photo of USS Oregon actually comes from my museum's collection. USS Oregon was also a museum ship up in Portland, Oregon, between the two world wars. And today the ship's mast can be visited in Portland at the Battleship Oregon Memorial Marine Park. And finally, the current USS Oregon is a Virginia-class attack submarine, keeping the name alive in the fleet. She was just commissioned a couple of years ago and is homeported in Groton, Connecticut with the Atlantic Fleet of submarines. Now, Oregon's connections to the Navy continue through the naming of ships for locations from all around the state, too. During World War II, there were quite a few U.S. Navy ships named after Oregon places. USS Astoria, USS Coos Bay, USS Eugene, and USS Mount Hood, being a few of them. They fought all over the globe. USS Willamette is another example. It was named for the Willamette River and was an oiler that refueled warships out at sea from 1982 to 1999. Now, after that early 1840s visit of the exploring expedition, there really wasn't a significant Navy presence here for a couple of decades. A few ships did stop here during the Civil War. There were Union warships that were based down in California at the Mare Island Navy Yard, and they were trying to stop Confederate raiders all up and down the Pacific. But aside from the occasional ship visit, Oregon really didn't see a lot of activity during the Civil War. But though the war was fought far from Oregon, the state's ties to the Civil War do include the contribution of lots of sailors and soldiers. Shown here is actually one of the state's earliest naval officers, Lieutenant Roswell Lamson. He actually came out to Oregon via the Oregon Trail when he was a young child. His family had a homestead up near Portland, and he attended the Oregon Institute, later becoming Willamette University, in the early 1840s. And he was the very first cadet from Oregon to attend the U.S. Naval Academy. He graduated in 1862, of course, right into the Civil War. He served in the Union Navy and commanded the gunboat USS Mount Washington, then USS Gettysburg, which was the fastest ship in the Navy's fleet at that time, towards the end of the war. And there have actually been 3 U.S. Navy ships named in honor of Lieutenant Lamson. He really can be considered the state's first naval hero. Now, into the early 1900s, there really weren't any major attempts to put permanent Navy facilities in Oregon. But soon after, there were a couple of major developments that would bring a naval presence to the state in more of a long-term fashion. First, the Navy started developing a series of Navy radio stations all along the coastline. These radio stations were designed to receive and transmit radio messages to and from the ships. They were all up and down the coasts of Washington, Oregon, and California. In Oregon, there were a handful of mostly short-lived stations. This particular image was taken at Cape Blanco, down near the southern edge of the state. Astoria was actually the longest-lived of these early radio efforts. It continued as a naval radio station all the way through World War II. And secondly, there was another interesting development, a state naval militia. This was roughly the Navy's equivalent to the Army's National Guard. And it's something that several states started trying out in the early 1900s. In Oregon, the naval militia was established in 1910. And the Navy lent the group a cruiser USS Boston that they could use as a training ship, and sent over a group of U.S. Navy officers, some of which are shown in this image, to serve as instructors for the group. There were about 200 members of the Oregon Naval Militia. Now, when the United States joined World War I, the naval militia ships went back to active duty service, and the members of the naval militia actually reported for wartime duty with the regular U.S. Navy. And the program itself eventually became merged with the Naval Reserves, so it was a pretty short-lived effort. Now, one of the members of this short-lived militia was Louis T. Barron Jr. He was the first naval aviator to come from the state of Oregon. He'd trained as a naval aviator right before World War I, and he was about to come back to Oregon to start up a naval aviation branch of their militia. But then all the members of that militia end up joining the U.S. Navy, and Lieutenant Barron finds himself serving in the U.S. Navy as Naval Aviator number 56. So he's really getting in on the ground floor of naval aviation. He'd later serve as both an instructor and a test pilot. The naval militia and the radio stations were just the start of the state's organized efforts to support the Navy. As soon as World War I broke out, up in Portland and in port cities like Astoria and Coos Bay, there were about a dozen Oregon shipyards that got government contracts to build wooden and steel warships for the war effort. You can see a wooden hull just starting to take shape in this wartime photograph. But in the Willamette Valley, World War I is really a story of service. It's a story of people, not of places. Though the area really didn't have any significant Navy installations during the war, Willamette Valley, including Salem and the surrounding communities, contributed hundreds of sailors for the war effort. There were about 3,000 Oregonians who served in the Navy during World War I. And while it would be impossible to do justice to every story of service originating in and around Salem, shown here are 7 of the state's sailors, including a pair of brothers who served during the war. They were radio operators, musicians, submarine electricians, pharmacist mates, lots of other duties as well. And as you can imagine, Salem residents were very glad to welcome their loved ones home at the end of the war. Shown here is a victory parade held at the war's end in Salem, and it actually comes from the collection of the Willamette Heritage Center. And for those familiar with the area, it was taken on Court Street near High Street. Now, of course, unfortunately, not every family was able to celebrate the war's end. Of the several thousand who had served, 88 sailors and soldiers from Marion County had lost their lives in service during World War I. Between the World Wars, Salem continued to send sailors into naval service. Here's one of the most famous sailors hailing from Oregon. Thomas Lee Gatch was born in 1891 to a pretty prominent Salem family. His grandfather had served as the president of Willamette University. His father had served as Salem's mayor. And Thomas himself attended the U.S. Naval Academy, graduating in 1912. He got his law degree, and then he spent a lot of his career in the Navy's Judge Advocate General, or JAG, office. He also served at sea, including famously as the commander of USS South Dakota, a battleship, during World War II in the Pacific, where he and his ship participated in important naval battles like Guadalcanal. He was actually wounded at Guadalcanal and ended up retiring as a vice admiral in 1947. Now, Salem and the surrounding Willamette Valley saw much more activity during World War II than in the previous war. The U.S. Navy actually had quite a bit going on in Oregon. There were several naval air stations, a blimp base, and training facilities throughout the state. And, of course, the state was also busy producing plenty of the goods that would be needed for the war effort. At shipyards in and near Portland, but really throughout the state, everyone was involved in the war effort. And, of course, thousands of Oregonians served in all branches of the military during the war. Perhaps most famously, the cities of Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington, became a major shipbuilding center, with shipyards producing literally thousands of vessels for the war effort. And Salem's proximity to these shipyards meant that the city contributed significantly to the war effort, both in terms of production and the support of naval personnel. Over in the Portland area, the Kaiser Shipyard's Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation churned out hundreds and hundreds of ships needed for the war effort. The ships built there carried cargo, moved troops, and participated in crucial naval missions throughout the Pacific. The shipyards in and around Portland turned out something like 2,000 ships during the war years, including around half of all the aircraft carriers produced in the country. They also built Liberty ships, which were cargo ships to carry supplies to the fighting fronts, and dozens of landing ships that would carry tanks and jeeps to the beaches, where they'd be used by the landing forces. Oregon's shipbuilding hub topped out at around 100,000 shipyard workers during the war. It was really a massive effort. Now, many Salem residents would have been drawn northward to the promise of shipyard work, but they were replaced by others who were drawn to the wartime industries in and around Salem itself. In the 1940s, the decade of the 40s, Salem population would jump by more than a quarter, about 32,000 in 1940, 43,000 by 1950. There were lots of industries in and around Salem that contributed to the war effort by sending their products to be used by soldiers and sailors around the world. Everything from fruit to sugar to grains was sent for the war effort. Shown here in an image from the Willamette Heritage Center collection is Talitha Magel Newson, a local resident who contributed to the war effort at the Thomas K. Woolen Mill, which produced blankets for use by the military. She was a weaver at the Woolen Mill, and her husband and high school sweetheart, Donald Newson, joined the Navy after graduation. He was aboard USS Franklin during the war. And I like her story because it is so illustrative of the story of many of the workers who worked in war production during the war years as they awaited their loved ones' return from the military. Now, the largest Navy base in Oregon during the war was Naval Air Station Astoria, also known as Tongue Point. It's located on the Columbia, near where it joins the Pacific Ocean. Early in the century, it was a naval radio station, and then there were thoughts of turning it into a submarine base around World War I, but with that short-lived war, that never quite came to fruition. But eventually in World War II, it becomes used as a base for Catalina flying boats that were stationed there to conduct coastal patrols, among lots of other uses. It was a pretty big base. And perhaps most importantly, Astoria was a buzzing center of activity, as most of the ships built in Portland and Vancouver came through there as their first stop in official Navy service. They'd be commissioned or placed into service here. This included aircraft carriers and cargo ships and all sorts of other vessels. And in Astoria, they were prepared for their first crew members, who would often be coming directly from boot camp to Astoria, where they'd ship out on their very first deployment. And at any given time, there was about 3,000 members of the military actually stationed in Astoria. At the height of the war effort, there was about one escort carrier a week commissioned there, and shown here is one of the most famous ones. Built in Vancouver, Washington, the escort carrier USS Liscum Bay was commissioned in Astoria in August of 1943, and immediately sent over to the war zone in the Pacific. And tragically, on November 24th of 1943, after just a few short months of service, she was hit by a Japanese submarine's torpedo attack. And within just a half hour, the ship sank, and 644 sailors were lost in the sinking. It remains the deadliest sinking of an aircraft carrier in the history of the U.S. Navy. These sailors would have come through Oregon on their way to the Pacific and never returned home. After the war's end, a vast fleet of Navy warships was laid up in Astoria, in mothballs until slowly sold off over the years, mostly for scrapping, as they were no longer needed in the Navy's fleet. And the Navy actually remained at Tongue Point until 1962, And even to the present day, there are still some Coast Guard operations based there. Now, Astoria was the largest, but not the only naval air station in Oregon during World War II. There was a smaller one at Klamath Falls Airport, which served as Klamath Naval Air Station during the war. It's where fighter pilots were trained. They conducted bombing practice over nearby reservoirs before heading out for combat in the Pacific. There were also naval air stations in Clatsop County, in Corvallis, in Lakeview, and North Bend, so all over the state. Now, the Tillamook Naval Air Station was given a very special job. It was a blimp base. From Tillamook, blimps would patrol to look for enemy ships and submarines. This base took up nearly 2,000 acres, and it had giant hangars to house the blimps. There were 2 blimp hangars, each 1,000 feet long and covering more than 7 acres. There was a squadron of 8 blimps that was stationed there. They were about 250 feet long and could head out for 48-hour missions at speeds of up to 50 knots, which is 57 miles an hour. They could head out as far south as California, as far north as the Canadian border. After the war, Tillamook ended up housing dozens of surplus aircraft that were no longer needed by the Navy until it was finally vacated in 1948. And in Salem itself, there were several naval offices during the war, mostly related to recruiting efforts. At Willamette University, there was a Navy V-12 unit, which was a college training program designed to increase the number of officers who were qualified to serve in the Navy. So the participants would go to college while preparing for life as a Navy officer. Now, with the Willamette V-12 program as one notable exception, most of the wartime facilities that were here in Oregon during World War II were intended to prevent the possibility of a Japanese attack on the Pacific coast. At that time, that seemed like a very real possibility. And in fact, there were some smaller scale attacks on Oregon and Washington. In June of 1942, a Japanese submarine shelled the shoreline at Fort Stevens, though it caused limited damage. And then late in the war, Japan tried a strategy of launching balloons that carried bombs. They'd drift on the jet stream until reaching the American mainland and falling to the surface. There were about 45 of these that landed in the state of Oregon alone. And the only casualties from such bombs actually occurred in Oregon as well. In May of 1945, a pastor and his wife had taken a group of children out for a picnic in the Klamath Falls area. They found the remains of a balloon, didn't really know what it was, and unfortunately triggered the bomb, killing the wife and the children. This tragedy showed that Oregonians, sadly, were closer to the war zone than they had thought. And partly as a result of these fears, during World War II, the coastline of Oregon became a critical defense point, home to lots of military bases and installations that not only protected the Pacific Northwest itself, but also contributed to the overall war effort by preparing all the ships and pilots and sailors that would be sent directly into the war zone. Now, not only did the areas surrounding Salem operate a number of major Navy facilities, but Salem's residents also found themselves directly in the war effort. In fact, Oregonians were contributing to the Navy's efforts from the very start of American entry into the war. Now, this is a story that I first heard as a student at Willamette University back in 2005, long before I knew I would end up working with the Navy, and it stuck with me all that time. In early December of 1941, Willamette University's football team traveled to Hawaii. They were going to play a series of games against the University of Hawaii. And as you can imagine, all these young, athletic college students were really excited for their stay in this tropical paradise. On December 6th in Honolulu, the Willamette Bearcats lost their first game of the series. And the next day, the students were planning to spend the day playing tourist. But history, of course, had other plans. The Japanese bombing that morning, of course, led to America's involvement in World War II. And the football players and all the male fans who had followed them to the island immediately volunteered to assist. They ended up serving nearly 2 weeks of guard duty alongside the Navy, as the island's usual manpower was directed elsewhere in the immediate aftermath of that attack. The football players finally returned to Oregon aboard a ship carrying wounded sailors back to the mainland for medical treatment. Now, Willamette's football players weren't the only Oregonians at Pearl Harbor on that fateful morning. At least half a dozen other sailors with ties to Salem were also there. And sadly, at least 15 Oregonians died at Pearl Harbor. Shown here is one of them. Delmore Sederstrom moved from Minnesota to Salem with his family when he was a teenager. He graduated from the University of Oregon and in 1941 became a Supply Corps officer with the Naval Reserve. He reported aboard the battleship USS Oklahoma in August of 1941, and he was on board on December 7th, 1941. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, 451 USS Oklahoma crew members were killed, and he sadly was among them. In his honor, USS Sederstrom, a destroyer escort, was named. Commissioned in September of 1943, it escorted convoys and delivered supplies throughout the Pacific. It supported the Battle of Iwo Jima and the invasion of Okinawa. The ship's bell is on display in Salem at the Oregon Department of Veterans Affairs building. By the war's end, many families in the city had lost loved ones. Salem had lost 142 sailors and soldiers. For those looking for a place to honor their service and sacrifice, there's an Oregon World War II memorial located on the grounds of the state capitol. And Salem is also home to several other places to honor the state's military veterans. Outside the Marion County Courthouse, there's a marble sculpture that stands as Salem's memorial to World War I veterans. And over on Summer Street, near the Department of Veterans Affairs building, there are 6 memorials to the state's military veterans, past and present, from conflicts spanning from the Spanish-American War to the Afghan-Iraqi Freedom Memorial. While most of the larger Navy facilities in Oregon closed down at the end of World War II, there have been a smattering of Navy facilities that have remained operational since the end of the war. And one of them was actually located right in Salem. A Naval Air Reserve Training Detachment was established in the late 1940s to support flight training. It was operated by Naval Air Station Seattle and based at McNary Airport in Salem, and it was home to as many as 1,000 aviators based around the Willamette Valley area and serving in the Naval Reserves. This meant that those military members would no longer need to go to Portland or Seattle for training. They could train right in Salem. 10 planes operated from a hangar at McNary Field, while the other Naval Reserve facilities also included shops and classrooms and an armory. And though the Navy portion of that airport has long since closed down, there's still a Naval Air Training Facility in Boardman, Oregon, up in the northeastern part of the state near the Columbia. Founded in 1941, this training facility is mostly used by personnel from Naval Air Station Whidbey Island up in Washington for training and testing relating to aircraft and drones. There are also 2 Navy support centers in Oregon, in Portland and in Springfield, to provide administrative services, training support, and other programs to serve the state's active duty and reserve sailors. And thus concludes the long saga of Oregon's relationship with the Navy. From the 1840s arrival of naval explorers, through the service of the battleship USS Oregon, to the many sailors sent from the state to fight in World War II, Salem's connection to the U.S. Navy runs deep. Thank you for joining me, and if this has piqued your curiosity about the Navy's operations in the Pacific Northwest, past and present, I invite you to visit the Puget Sound Navy Museum in Bremerton, Washington. Thank you.